Masquera say Mre Zimbabwe, welcome to our channel Zim Confessions and Deep Secrets. Kana katika kutanga kukuya paneno channel, please don't forget to subscribe. Kana uchungwa gara waka subscribe, but don't forget to comment and share this video. Nasi Mre Zimbabwe tabigirai nyaburitswa na the opposition political activist Gift Ostalos Siziwa Buda achitaura about the current state of politics in Zimbabwe. Atawara zakari the current state opposition zvakare nemaeconomic situations living conditions ari muno muzimbabwe. Zimbabwe ataura zvakare about the plan yava Nelson Chamisa achiti what needs to be done kuti nyika ienderere mberi. So achitaura izvi in a Twitter space yakahostwa the Citizens Movement Radio on their X handle murezimbabwe apa akainterviewa achitaura pamusoro penhaurirwa idzodzi murezimbabwe. So tingade kuisa nguva ita kuti mungonzwa zvakataurwa na Gift Ostalos Siziwa muhamadza zvamuri kufunga pamusoro penyaya iyi mucomment section.
Very much, Uncle Jed, for hosting this important space to discuss the state of the democratic opposition in Zimbabwe. We meet, at a time when our country is at crossroads. 44 years after independence, our people are still living in abject poverty. Our people have not had the full expression and realization and the fruit and the benefit of the lifting of the Union Jack. We've had political independence without it affecting and changing the concrete lives of our people. A lot has happened in the past 4 decades in our country. Those that sacrificed to go to war for the freedom of our country, and this anticipation that even if we die in the liberation struggle, we live a country where every Zimbabwean is going to have the freedom to move around, the freedom to criticize their government, the freedom to live a life better than the dogs of the rich. Those were the aspirations of the liberation struggle, at least pronounced by the few historic materials that most of us interact with. But all these things have not been realized. Decades after independence, we convened on the 11th of September 1999 to build an alternative, a democratic movement to try and advance these aspirations of the liberation project. But at the center of the liberation struggle was the right for Zimbabweans to choose leaders of their choice and for them to live better in their country. Those were the aspirations of the liberation struggle. And it is on that basis that the labor movement, being the dominant social and political force of the first decade of our country, was inspired to wage a new democratic struggle in our country. So I give this reference because it is important to understand where we are coming from, particularly as the democratic opposition, and more importantly, to show and locate the democratic opposition in Zimbabwe within the broader journey that our country from Rhodesia to Zimbabwe has sojourned. That is the journey from the liberation struggle, from the liberation consensus to the democratization consensus, and now the transformation consensus. So from independence, from 1980 to this very day, our country, in our respectful view, has been grappling with one thing and one thing alone: governance. Governance has been the major problem in the post-independent Zimbabwe. Our inability to conduct free, fair, and credible election. We've always given a reference to the election that happened in 1980, the election that happened in 2000, the decade of 2000, the election that happened in the decade of 2010, and the decade of 2020 to this very day. All of them, without exception, being subjected to legal and political challenges. Whereas in all jurisdictions world over, elections are a process to renew a social contract, to renew the relationship between those who are being governed and those that govern, to give mandate, basically. And a society without that is a society in turmoil. A society without a coherent social contract is a troubled society. So it is basically a society at war. That's why our country faces the same problems that countries that had war are facing, like the Democratic Republic of Congo and other countries in turmoil, because of the inability to renew the contract of those that lead through a credible process that is acceptable to participants. Philosophized our problem since 1980, not just as the democratic opposition, but as a people, as a nation. This is what we are grappling with. I say this because I'm going to talk about the challenges of the democratic opposition, particularly post 2023. But I thought it's important for our listeners, Zimbabweans, and those in the region, and those that care about the case of Zimbabwe, to understand where the center of gravity of the Zimbabwean problem is. It is the inability to conduct credible elections. It is the inability to produce a leadership that is accepted by the people. But when we don't resolve that, it means that everything becomes immediate casualty. The economy, everything that happens, policies, government functions, everything is an immediate casualty of how you conduct and renew the contract of those that are given the national mandate. The 2023 is a full expression of that. We went into an election which was clearly a sewer pond. And many people ask, why is it that as the democratic opposition, you went into an election pretty knowing that it is a sewer pond? We did so because we are a democratic organization. We believe that power must be transferred through elections. That's why we participate in elections. And this has built so much cynicism in electoral politics in Zimbabwe, because from 1980 to this very day, because elections have not been able to reflect the will of the people, Zimbabweans in general, we talk to Zimbabweans in the countryside, we talk to Zimbabweans in the urban space, and Zimbabweans in the diaspora. At the conclusion is that elections in Zimbabwe are held as a ritual. They don't produce, it's just a 5-year ritual. And that is not the case in Zimbabwe alone. It's a case in different parts of the country. Just a few days ago, our friends within the democratic opposition in Namibia are facing this same problem of elections in Africa being a ritual without democracy. Because in Namibia, a country with 1 million+ citizens, took time, it has had an election which was problematic. So this is the African problem. This is the problem with elections. And this is sponsored in our body politic. The ordinary Zimbabweans, particularly young people and the millennials who are the major democratic group, are really cynical about the election as a means of changing government. The consensus among these young people is that elections don't work. We participate in these elections as a democratic opposition because that is the only method that we believe can be used to change government. And Zimbabweans have got a right to look into this for the past 40 years, whether elections or not have worked to bring change. And if not, what is the other option? And is it a sustainable option? Because a political organization ought to look at its method and how it is informed by its own ideological impetus, its values, and of course its strategic objective. What is it that you want to achieve? Do you want power for the sake of power, or you want power for the sake of changing the lives of ordinary Zimbabweans? And to what extent are you prepared to give into the process to attain political power? And this is what has informed a lot of the problems world over. And as the democratic opposition, we faced these questions, but we answered our call that, look, the Citizens Coalition for Change, as was founded in January 2022, is a democratic opposition that believes that power must be attained through the ballot and not the bullet. That's why we went into an election. That election has its own challenge, acknowledged and recognized by everyone who participated in the process, from Zimbabweans to SADC, the African Union, the Carter Center, the EU Observer Mission, and everyone that witnessed the election in our country, that it was a sham, that it failed the litmus test of a free, fair, and a credible process. But where are we now as the democratic opposition? I must acknowledge that, like any movement was over, it became natural that after the election, because we confirmed our very firm position that we don't accept the outcome of the election, because it has been rejected by everyone who observed the election. Zimbabweans themselves are confirming that this election was fraudulent, that it was fair, it was not fair, and it was not credible. It is on that basis that the people still made the position that it does not accept the outcome of the election. Because that election did not produce the will of the people. So it is on that basis that we knew that by taking this very same position, ASAUT was going to follow after. And we're presented with making choices whether or not we get consumed by this or we make a very firm position and leave the consequences of our position. We chose the latter. We made a very firm position which we confirmed publicly. We are followed by the assault to our movement, removal of members of parliament, removal of councillors, the assault on the democratic opposition as an institution, the introduction of fake leaders and money exchanging hands within the democratic opposition, and our opponents using existing cracks and all the avenues to try and cause problems within the democratic opposition. Is it new? It is nothing new. Did we know? Yes, we knew that once we've made this same position, particularly of not endorsing the presidents of Mr. Mnangagwa, we knew that naturally we are going to face this assault. The movement was attacked, people went into tailspin, a lot of Zimbabweans then became even more doubtful about the prospects of democratic processes and electoral outcome in our country. After that, obviously, we had a period of introspection as the leadership collective within the democratic opposition, particularly the authentic, because the dictatorship always wants to create an opposition of their choice. So ZANU-PF created its own opposition. They preferred the form of the individuals that joined the charade in parliament and endorsed the current establishment and undermined democratic processes and wishes and aspirations of ordinary people. Some with principles stood their own principles, and history is there to judge, particularly the individual leaders and participants of these processes. But nonetheless, we had our own processes of reflection. We met with the people across the entire part of the country, a process that was led by the organizing department of the democratic opposition, to try and listen to the people in terms of what people think is the way forward for the democratic opposition. President Chamisa resigned naturally because the TPC has lost its credentials and credibility as a vehicle to take Zimbabweans forward. And it is on that time that we took the opportunity to reflect. We commissioned the process of the road data to try and do an intellectual evaluation of the movement. How did we perform in the election? What went wrong? And what went well? Because in every electoral process, any serious organization has its own periods of reflection. It doesn't matter even if you win government, you get into a position of reflection. We reflected on the prospects of the democratic opposition. The first thing that became very clear in the conversations was that, one, Zimbabweans affirmed their position that in as far as ordinary people are concerned, the leader of the democratic opposition and the democratic alternative in this country is President Advocate Nelson Chamisa. That became the immediate national consensus. The second consensus was that Zimbabweans think that the democratic opposition must be able to convene and make sure that they wage a collective fight against dictatorship in our country, therefore giving us the necessary fuel to be able to continue organizing, to be able to build our party. It is on that basis that the conclusion then became what we communicated publicly when we say our task and immediate responsibility became that of building a credible alternative. And I underline a credible alternative, which is the task that we've been fixated with to try and look at the character and content of the alternative that was to build. Because when you are attacked, you have to take stock. Yes, we have been attacked. That is not what anyone would have anticipated when we went into the 2023 election. But dictatorship have always had this semblance of making sure that the opposition is annihilated and completely fizzled out of the race. But we stood firm. We then looked ourselves and say, how do we build an alternative that is credible, that has got the capacity to wage this struggle against dictatorship, which is clearly one anchored and entrenched within the military complex in our country. And secondly, that is entrenched within the body politic of our country. So these were part of the reflections about the context that we are operating in. Zimbabwe is operating in a very abnormal environment. We are waging a struggle in very difficult circumstances, I must acknowledge. But that as it may, you have to reflect, you have to pick yourselves up and say, how do we move forward as a people, which is the process that we've been doing. That's why you have seen that the general communication has emerged from the democratic opposition, but the clock is ticking towards us, making sure that we come up with a relaunching of a radical movement that can be able to advance our struggle to the next level. So that is where we are. We have been able to ensure that we strengthen our social base, because political organizations function on the basis of a social base. It is not possible to have a political movement or a political organization which does not have a social base. Part of our reflections reflected that there is a changing dynamic around the political base in Zimbabwe. When we started our struggle as the democratic opposition in 1999, the social base was coming from the labor movement and the student fraternity. But the labor movement has fizzled out because of the unemployment situation in the country. That's to ZANU-PF. 97% of our people are unemployed. Therefore, making the changes within the social base. And any serious political organization that wants to organize and build in our country ought to look at these changing dynamics within our country. In the past 2 decades, Zimbabweans have moved away from our country as economic and political refugees to South Africa, to the United Kingdom, and other parts of the world. So all these inform how we want to begin and launch this vehicle to take Zimbabweans forward. And thirdly, we've also been reflecting, as I've said, around the character. Having been in the democratic opposition for the past 2 decades, it became natural that we ought to reflect, what is this character of the organization that we intend to build? How do we make it better from what we have been having in the past 2 decades? Because the only thing we can take from what happened yesterday are lessons. We can spend years regretting about people being removed from parliament, about people selling out to the regime, about people betraying, which has become the dominant conversation within our body politic. Who did this, who did that, and this digressed binary politics that has poisoned our nation. And what is most important for us within the democratic opposition what is it that we are picking from this rich history of 2 decades of fighting against tyranny and naked contact with violence and terror? So it is on that basis that we reflected around the character. Remember that the democratic opposition in 1999, it was responding to the structural adjustment program. It was responding to Mugabe's shift to the World Bank and the IMF-led structural adjustment program, because they affected the social life of ordinary Zimbabweans, people getting retrenched and suffering because Mugabe had changed their ideological stance and started going towards and leaning towards neoliberal politics and the right. So this informed part of because forming a movement must also be informed by the conscience of the moment. It must be informed by the national question. What is the question of the time? What is the national grievance? And what is the national vision and common aspirations of ordinary people? So in 99, the common position by the working class is that ISAP doesn't work, that the structural adjustment program is the enemy of the oppressed, and therefore people must organize the labor-based party. Why this is important? Because it informed that the new movement that was formed in 99 became a center-left social democratic party. That's why the key value of the democratic movement from that day to now has been the anchor of solidarity, that the oppressed of the world must unite and fight against fascism and dictatorship and, of course, capitalism in its various forms. So now we reflect in the environment that we live in, not only in Zimbabwe, but even international. What is the ever-changing geopolitics of the world? Look at what's happening right now in the world. It also informs the character of the movement that we must build, because our country is not going to exist in isolation. So the questions around ideology have been dominating the conversation around the new movement. What character should it take? And secondly, the reflections around, and before I go to the second point, it is also about the character of the movement also informs what are the policy propositions that we're going to bring. Because for the past 20 years, we've had very strong national positions as the democratic opposition. And it's a moment, while this the organization and the movement has been attacked, it becomes a moment to reflect again around the policy propositions and non-negotiable positions of the democratic opposition. What are those positions? We reflect around the question of land in our country. We reflect around the big question of sanctions in our country. We reflect around the big questions about re-engagement with the community around us, SADC, the African Union, and the different economic blocs like the Commonwealth, which ZANU-PF left because of various politics. So all these reflections must inform the movement. And again, we're having this space a few days after Mthuli Mube announced his pro-poor budget. The movement also assesses itself in terms of how it responds also to these neoliberal politics and economic order that characterize our opponents in ZANU-PF, and how we intend to respond to these pertinent questions of our country. Do we have to support a ruling establishment that is overtaxing the poor as a method to grow the economy? And how do we interact with the ruling establishment that believes that the private sector must lead economic development? So all these questions, how do we interact with different arms of government in our country in the context of a polarized Zimbabwe Electoral Commission whose chief election officer is a non-political activist, whose leader is wearing a political party symbol of our opponents? How do we interact with these institutions? Because we ought to redefine how we are going to be interacting with institutions of the state. That is informed by our 2 decades experience. Whether if our complete disengagement, for example, for someone passing communication, whether our disengagement with the ZBC in the past two decades, what does it say? Is do we have to reflect as a communications department whether or not our stance with a broadcaster that has taken a clearly partisan position? How do we interact with that kind of a state broadcast? How do we interact with securocrats in our, no doubt, fellow Zimbabweans, that the military is the decisive power bloc in our country? So we have to answer these questions. How do we interact with securocrats in our country who in November 2017 became the decisive power bloc within ZANU's own internal political transition? It was informed not by ordinary ZANU-PF people but by men and women in military fatigue. So the democratic opposition ought to answer these hard questions. How do we interact with our relations between Harare and Brussels? How do we interact on the relationship between Harare and Beijing? How do we interact with the relationship between Harare and Moscow? How do we interact between the relationship between Harare and London? So all these issues are important because the international relations posture and foreign policy objective of the new vehicle ought to be answered succinctly and in a more coherent manner. And it must be informed by these founding principles and values. How do we locate the role of young people within the broader democratic opposition, the role of women? The bigger question that everyone has been talking about, what should be the structure of this vehicle? How should it be structured? What is it informed by? What has worked? What didn't work? What processes internally must inform this movement? All these questions, we ought to answer them. How do we mobilize in an era of authoritarian tutelage? What is going to be our method of engagement? What is going to be our method of struggle? How do we intend to attain political power? And lastly, what is it that we intend to do when we govern? Because all those questions must be clearly answered. How do we interact with parliament of our country? How do we interact with different ministries? How do we interact with critical state events? But these are critical questions for the past 20 years that we have to reflect on whether or not progressive forces ought to attend certain national events and processes. How do we build a united society? So those are hard questions. How are we going to resolve the challenges that our people are facing? These are not easy questions that have easy answers, because our society is divided. If you ask an ordinary average Zimbabwean, they have different views from our discovered about all these questions, whether or not President Chamisa must be seen in Heroes Acre, whether or not the opposition must pronounce itself in certain platforms regionally and internationally. So all these questions are what have been dominating the internal conversations within the broader democratic opposition. The intention, fellow Zimbabweans, is to build a formidable and a credible alternative. It goes back to the characters that must also be part and parcel of that composition. I can say with absolute confidence that with all the movements within the elite, because the shifts that we have seen with Chabang and all these are not the shifts within the democratic opposition, because the ordinary average Democrat in this country has not shifted their persuasion and standpoint. What has shifted are different elite interests within our body politic in the country. And the reflections also include that, because the elite composition is part and parcel of our struggle. The middle class informs part and parcel of the composition of the character that must be within the democratic opposition. So we also reflect around our relationships in the region and in the continent, our Pan-African position. How are they going to be reasserted? How do we reassert ourselves in the region? How do we reassert ourselves in the continent as genuine progressive Pan-Africanists? How do we reassert that position in a face of propaganda that has been spread against us as a regime change agent, as people that are not patriotic? How do we reassert it? Especially in the face that when you reassert your position internationally as a proud Zimbabwean, you are doing so while your comrades is in prison. You are doing so while comrades have been killed. So how do you balance between pronouncing yourself as a proud Zimbabwean in a global stage and at the same time raising these critical questions around abductions and torture and capture of the democratic opposition in our country? So all these complexities and dynamics inform what we've been trying to build. And we are proud that we have not yet easy answers, but we've reflected upon these questions and intend that whatever decisive political stance that we must take as the democratic opposition answers those questions in a very succinct and clear manner. And that's why we have been requesting patience when we're building this process from those that have been supporting the democratic opposition. It is understandable, fellow Zimbabweans, that there is a lot of cynicism in our country. It is totally understandable. But how do you continue trusting electoral processes when you vote and the next thing your member of parliament is removed without your consent, without the consent of the political party that you supported. It is only natural that Zimbabweans get frustrated. That's why you see the anger that ordinary Zimbabweans have, not just towards the democratic opposition, but because of the detail of the political in our country. It also informs, lastly, why there is now a lot of shifts within the party politics. We wrote this when we started the Triple C fellow Zimbabweans, that ours is a long and winding, protracted struggle for freedom, because we knew pretty well that these things are going to happen. That before we get to the final destiny, we're going to face challenges. And we did not claim that we've got the answers. But what we knew and promised Zimbabweans is that we are not going to betray. That is our own proposition and standpoint. That even as I'm speaking to you right now, we cannot officially and confidently claim that we're going to have solid answers about resolving our situation in the country. But we are part and parcel of these small little efforts by all Zimbabweans, whether it's someone sending $5 to their parents to try and survive, or it is someone who's in the diaspora trying to build a small hospital in their own rural home, or buying tablets, or it is the efforts of those in the non-governmental sector trying to feed our people in a period where a third of our population is living abject poverty and it is food insecure. All these little efforts are efforts by Zimbabweans. So we are part and parcel of these small efforts by different people, even those within the establishment who are trying their best in their limited ways to try and make our country a better place. So we are part and parcel of those that have said we are availing ourselves. We are not geniuses. We don't have all the answers, but we are just part and parcel of Zimbabweans that have availed themselves to say we are answering this difficult leadership task to try and find solutions to our country. It is a complex question. So all these have been dominating the conversations within the party politics for the past 1 year, to say, how do we sufficiently answer this? How do we interact with business in our country in a polarized society? Because, I mean, it's very difficult for an average business Zimbabwean person to pronounce themselves, or even an average artist to pronounce where they stand because of the victimization that they face. It's not easy for a person to even avail themselves for leadership within the democratic opposition in our country, because the right people, the competent people, find it very difficult, because when people look at the few of us who have availed themselves, they say, why should I burden myself with this? You live like you are a permanent prisoner, because wherever you go, you are followed, you are monitored. You face these accusations. People give you Dante hires all these trolls to attack you. You are attacked physically. Honorable Chibaya just recently, before he was arrested, was being hounded and harassed by a polarized state agent. So these are the lived realities. And how do you attract people of substance and people with quality leadership credentials to join the democratic opposition in the face of these realities? And why people say it's a basic game, it's a platform for people who have nothing to lose. So it's how complex our country is. And as I conclude, Uncle Jed, we are very much confident and impressed by the conversations that have been informing and taking place within the democratic opposition, and the answers that have come from our people in different spaces and platforms. I must acknowledge that at times we go into platforms like Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, to just listen to the people, not even those who agree with us, but those with different opinions, to say, okay, this is what you expect from us within the democratic opposition, and how are we going to make it become the feature of our movement. We even listen to some of the attacks that we get from those that differ with us, so that we ensure that at least the best of our ability will build a credible alternative. And in no time we're going to pronounce ourselves around these reflections and how they inform the democratic opposition going forward. Thank you very much.